Thank you, Mike, very much. Well, I think those were three fantastic, different but with some common themes, presentations to start off our debate today. And I'm now going to throw it open for questions and comments from the floor, picking up on any of the points that have been raised or others that you would like to raise around these relationships between science and politics, the way they operate, the way they might operate. We've heard some powerful arguments here. Do you agree? Do you disagree? I'm going to take a round of questions and comments. There's a roving mic, so if you stick your hand up, Naomi will find you, and then I'll turn back to the panel to respond. So who'd like to go first?
Yeah, I've got a different view to you, Mike, on what consensus in IPCC is. What you've said is minority views should be within the report, and I agree 100%. And I think in many cases, that's what they do. So the consensus is, do we agree with each of these chapters and key conclusions? And that can be, where do we agree almost unanimously, and what is the evidence? But where we don't agree, these assessments should show where the majority view is with its evidence, but should absolutely show all the minority views with its evidence or lack of evidence. So I think consensus is important, but for consensus to be agreed, the report should show majority views with evidence, minority views. And the consensus is this is a fair reflection of the state of knowledge, basically. And that, I think the IPCC has made some missteps. I don't think they did sea level particularly well in the fourth assessment. But in general, views of people like Dick Lindzen, which are not in the mainstream, normally are now shown in IPCC reports. So the consensus is the ability to show areas of consensus, areas of agreement, disagreement, what's robust, and I think that's been very important in IPCC, trying to look at where there is large amounts of knowledge, which is an agreement, large amounts of knowledge where there's significant disagreement, or where there's apparent agreement, but it's a very flimsy database. So I'm not sure we're far apart. It's a question of whether we view IPCC and other assessment bodies has brought the debate and the areas of controversy adequately to the fore.
Great, and I think these are key points that don't necessarily apply just to climate change and IPCC, but potentially to many others. Andy.
Thanks very much. Yeah, wonderfully rich insights and principles there for action. But I just wanted to, what the panel's views are on something I think has remained somewhat below the surface, popping up here and there in all the talks, but not really centre stage, which is the role of power. Power has a role, albeit constrained in many ways, in shaping knowledge and in bounding evidence and conditioning evidence in ways that have been drawn out in the talks. So it strikes me that part of, alongside the responsibilities of individuals and the methods that have been drawn attention to, speaking about power and the ways in which it has a role in the shaping of evidence and science itself must be part of the mix. But it's a bit awkward because it's a breach of etiquette too openly, again for reasons that I touched on about justification, to be too open about speaking of power. And I'm wondering if a key part of it is let's be more mature and open about speaking about power in science.
Yeah, let me just respond to Bob's comment. So I think, to explore this further, I think it would be useful to distinguish between internal processes of deliberation within the IPCC and then rhetorically how the IPCC gets presented and communicated by commentators and actors outside. And I think there are two different discussions we could have then about the value of consensus or dissensus. And certainly there is clearly disagreement that goes on within IPCC deliberations. I know that full well, and actually many of the individual chapters in many senses reflect a lot of that scientific disagreement. The problem is, though, that as those sort of ground level disagreements emerge and take place, and as they filter through the various layers into the higher and higher levels up to the summary for policymakers, these tend to get squeezed out. Simply, one could argue, benevolently, because of the need for simplification. But of course, that process of simplification loses perhaps some of the key requirements to keep the gaps, I think, in knowledge that Miles was referring to, which actually are creative spaces where politics can really get to work. And they tend to get squeezed out as you go higher and higher through the IPCC process. The other thing I would still say, though, is that why does the IPCC not embrace more explicit forms of elicitation or voting to just make very, very transparent the fact that there are experts here with very different views, and they will disagree with each other, rather than sort of always the tendency is to suppress that for the sake of this maintenance of an authority, which in the end is paradoxically going to weaken the state of science, I think, or the status of science in political debate.
Thanks. Andy typically has raised a really big issue here, and I suspect we could have a whole additional conference on this one. You have to think in this area, where is power being exercised and by whom and for what purpose? And on the one hand, I think you could see, if you like, political power being exercised to control framings, to close debate and so forth. That power itself, of course, is being exercised because there are other powers elsewhere, the democratic pressures to get on with it and do something, to find the answer, whatever it is. What I was trying to get at in the importance of openness of process is that I think this gives us our best possible way of addressing the issues of power, but doing so in terms of open debate, not about what the power structure is, but about what it's actually saying. Because I think we can't dismantle the various power structures, but we can assess what knowledge and authority is coming from them, and the more open we can be in debate, I think the better.
Yeah, I'll just quickly say to Andy's comment, yes. I mean, I think that's if it wasn't clear in my presentation, I think you could say this is all about power and be almost completely correct. And I think where I would kind of tease this out is to say that there's a big difference between the power of choice in democratic systems and the power over choice in democratic systems. And I think one of the things that experts need to come to terms with is that participating in democratic systems means that the people, however that's constituted in a particular system, the people have every right to make a decision in a manner different than the experts would if the experts were in charge. And empowering people to make choices versus compelling them to make choices is where power shows up in kind of the most important distinction that experts can make.
Great. Okay, I'm going to go for another round of questions now. We had one halfway up here.
Mike Hulme's talk in particular got me thinking about Collingridge and Reeves's book about science influencing policy, and the idea that we're always going to get disagreement to different extents about the science. Science isn't going to settle the question of what we do about the knowledge that we have. So it just got me thinking, what is the rationale? I mean, I know we've had scandals recently, or perceived scandals, ClimateGate, the grey literature issue in IPCC, but how has the policy framework really been affected by this? And do we really need to be talking about these disagreements as if they're really hitting the rationale for politics? Because I'm not entirely convinced for the rationale for policy, if that makes sense.
Great. Question here, over on the right. Sorry, I should have asked. It would be really helpful if people could just briefly introduce themselves, as you very kindly did. Just say who you are.
Thanks. I'm Simon Burrell. I'm Director of Involve and also Head of Public Dialogue for ScienceWise. Both Mike and Miles, you talked about openness in the process. This is a big thing also for the government now in open policy making. But what does that mean? Open data sets, but what data sets and how and what context? Totally open process, can we observe everything? What actually does openness mean in a way that it will help the public to understand the evidence and the public to understand the context of the evidence? We can't be open about absolutely everything. So nitty gritty, what does openness really mean?
Very good question. I think I've got one at the back. Actually, I've now got lots and lots. So we'll go right to the back here. Is that Brian, I see? It is.
Thanks very much. Brian Wynne from Lancaster University and currently somewhere in the Arctic. Yeah. Thanks to all the speakers for their very rich presentations. I just wanted really to respond to Mike's observations about perhaps dissensus is a more robust and resilient way of thinking about scientific advice in policy domains than insistent consensus. I guess my response would be, Mike, and this isn't something new to you, that actually the robustness question depends upon the quality of the, as it were, the arena of response. So that thinking about, for example, and here we come to Andy's questions about power, Oreskes and Conway on the manufacture of doubt, not only in the case of climate, deliberate manufacture of doubt and uncertainty and dissensus, through all kinds of manipulation, including even of scientific journals and peer review processes and so on. Then there are big questions about what are the assumptions about the basis of dissensus and disagreement that is seen to undermine consultation in policy and, as it were, getting to the right result. And how does that relate to those kinds of assumptions about the interpretation of dissensus in the science, in the domain of policy and practice?
Great. Down to the front, if we could. I think that was keeping everybody zooming around here.
Hi, my name is Stefan Elba. I'm the director of the Centre for Global Health Policy here at the University of Sussex. And I was very struck, Roger, by your illustration of the big issues in relation to kind of local restaurant choice. But I also wanted to kind of flip this around and building on what Melissa was saying about the global dimension about a lot of these issues, whether you or other panelists could say a little bit more about how the kind of increasingly globalized context and the notion of transnational and international policy networks, how that is really beginning to shape this relationship between scientific expertise and policy making. I'd be quite interested in your views on that.
Great. Over here.
So I'm Roland Jackson, Executive Chair of ScienceWise. Again, a comment, mostly from Mike Hulme, but fascinated by all three talks actually, but particularly your question about consensus and dissensus, and the looking at the climate change debate at the moment, the sense that because of this real emphasis on consensus, there isn't a real locus for open public discussion. And I'm not thinking now just of the policy space, I mean open public societal discourse about this. Essentially, the way that the evidence is framed scientifically, you're either for us or you're against us. So can you say a bit, just unpack a bit more about what you think IPCC and the scientific community generally could do to open up that dissensus in a way that would lead to a broader broader public debate?
Okay, and Sue, near the back there.
Thanks. It's Susan Owens from University of Cambridge. It's a question specifically directed at Roger, but I'm sure that Miles and Mike will have a view as well. Roger, you made the point about the tenacity of the linear model and the deficit model. And his terribly simple question is why? Why is it so tenacious? And is that somehow a reflection of some sort of power, picking up on Andy's point? Or is it a reflection that actually the model is rather useful both to scientists and to political, well, I should say other political actors? I've asked this question many times. I've never received an answer that I'm wholly convinced by, so I'll ask it again. Triumph of hope over experience.
Okay, very good. I think everybody should use this as an opportunity to raise the questions they always raise and never get satisfactory answers. We may still not, but it'll make for a good debate. So I'm going to take one more. Eric, And then we'll let our panelists respond. We've got a rich array of questions there.
Yes, thank you very much. I'm Eric Millstone. I'm fortunate enough to be a member of the STEPS Centre and based here at Sussex. And I was intrigued by Mike's account of consensus dissensus in the IPCC, and I don't wish to contest that account of that particular example, but want to suggest that it is perhaps untypical. Because if we can think of other cases, this is a very British case, Wakefield's contestation of the safety of the mumps, measles and rubella vaccine certainly didn't make the dominant view seem more persuasive. Similarly, when Seralini publishes papers suggesting there might be hazards from GM crops that European Food Safety Authority have not addressed, that doesn't make EFSA seem more credible. So while your representation of the IPCC case may be entirely accurate, might it also be unrepresentative and untypical?
Excellent. Right, panelists, respond as you see fit. We've got an array of more specific and more general questions and comments on the floor. I'll start with this end this time, so Roger.
Right. I'll respond to several of these, hopefully with one answer. The question about the linear model, the deficit model, it does work. It works in certain circumstances, and in the Honest Broker, I argue it works in cases what are called tornado politics. So if a tornado, probably not, but if a tornado is approaching this building, facts will dictate our action. I can say that pretty assuredly, that whether we go down to a shelter or not. And all we need to know is the meteorological fact of the position, speed, and direction of the tornado. Why does the linear model work in that case? It works in that case because we all have a shared value of not dying. And I think in a lot of cases what we try to do is map that sort of thinking onto wicked problems, complex problems, and it also, behind your question, privileges certain groups over others. But the idea that if only, this is scientific rationalism, goes back hundreds of years, if only the basis for political consensus could be found in agreement on facts, then science holds the key to unlocking the perfection of society. Now, I do detect, and the issue of consensus, it has never really been an issue for me. I write a lot, I blog, but consensus is, as a political scientist, it is a boundary condition on policy design. And if you take a look at literature on when major societal action was taken on any range of issues, from the Iraq War to social insurance programs, and you ask, what was the state of public agreement on the policy and the facts that underlie the policy? Policy action occurs at all levels of agreement. The idea that we have to have some sort of a scientific consensus to take any sort of action at any level is, I think, is a fallacy and just a reincarnation of this linear model. I often quote Walter Lippmann, who was a wonderful political commentator in the United States in the first half of the 20th century, and he has this brilliant quote that distills a lot for me. He says, politics is not about getting people to think alike. It's about getting people who think differently to act alike. And I think that a lot of us included in science policy and STS world, this is an aside, I did write a while ago that we complain about the linear model, and we do so in journal articles that are published in obscure journals that we expect is going to fill somebody's head and they'll throw away the linear model. A lot of the debates, particularly in the environmental area, but other areas, operate from the simple expectation that if the facts are conveyed, the action will follow. We speak to how that's not right, but our actions, the debates about consensus kind of belie that simple expectation.
Thanks. With this collection of questions, we could be here a while, but I'll try and boil it down. On the linear model, and particularly the deficit model, I think the problem we have in part is that it's based in turn on two sets of assumptions which are very easy, and that's part of their staying power. One is a logical positivist view of science, that it's about facts, so if you can only get the facts across, they'll speak for themselves. And I think what we've been trying to address, all three of us, has been dealing with actually the uncertainties, the incompletenesses, the best guesses and so forth. And I think the other underlying concept, again particularly in the deficit model, is a model of human communication which suggests that it can be done in hard concrete steps, and if I know something, then I can convey that knowledge to you clearly, succinctly, and to your absolute understanding. And this is absolutely not the case. If anything, I'm with the Sam Beckett model that human communication is inherently impossible. So I think what we're trying to do through open systems of discussion of the science underlying policy, and indeed policies themselves, is use the processes of dialogue to try and improve each other's comprehension of where the other is coming from and what it all means. And hence, I think we get into these difficult areas about what does consensus actually mean. At best, it means a common understanding at a particular time. And all of this comes back to the thought that while these systems are necessarily imperfect, it is probably better that we recognize the imperfections and talk openly about them than that we try and close down too early. Now, some of that comes back exactly to what Andy was raising about power in the system, because of course power can distort the nature of that dialogue, and I'd be really pleased to have that discussion with Andy over a pint. But I think that addresses most of the questions here. The one that I'd pick up is Stephen's question about the global dimensions of all this, because what we then get into is the added layers of complexity in the whole process of communication, and the extent to which people come into those discussions with totally different value systems, and indeed with totally different connotations to the way they're using even languages that we think we have in common. So it doesn't surprise me that global issues are difficult to deal with. It surprises me that we occasionally actually succeed in getting to policy agreement on them.
Yeah, thank you for such a good range of questions. So, I'm just starting with Eric's first. I mean, I would suggest there is a difference between, say, a case like MMR with a large transnational, transdisciplinary assessment of a multidimensional complex question like climate change. And the MMR case, if I understand it correctly, was based on a very particular published scientific finding in a peer-reviewed journal, which through various social and cultural dynamics then sort of became salient and center stage. All I would say is that I think as one moves into these larger scale assessments of complex issues that cross boundaries between cultures and disciplines and nations, my argument would become more powerful. I think that finding spaces for dissensus, officially sanctioned dissensus, becomes more and more important. But I would agree that there needs to be a certain differentiation in different types of science controversy about that. The point about the new social spaces for deliberation that Roland mentioned, I mean, this is interesting, isn't it? I think, and what in a way the IPCC and what it came up against in 2009-10, that this clash of cultures that suddenly erupted between a culture of scientific expertise and authority that actually predated the internet. Back, you know, the IPCC was created in 1988, and suddenly in 2009, this new culture of open, participatory, you know, there's a low entry tariff through social media, and the IPCC was still operating in a very different cultural universe, almost to this new social reality. And 2009-10 was just this eruption of and clash of cultures, and I think there are adjustments taking place, certainly in the whole climate science arena. I mean, there are some very high quality live instant discussions going on the social media around key climate science concepts. The latest one around the climate sensitivity. And these are spaces where protagonists can enter with low entry tariffs and make valid arguments. And I think that is a creative use of some of these social spaces. I think there is an issue then about Brian's point about where, well, I'm not quite sure. What is your point? That ideological influences, that there are certain ideological influences that we need to somehow suppress or pathologize, whereas there are other ideological interests that we need to valorize. I mean, I think either we do it or we don't, and whether those interests have got a very particular ideological taint on them, or whether they don't. I mean, a lot of the sniping climate critics, I would say, have not got powerful connections to any of these Machiavellian interests at all. They just have certain libertarian instincts, or they are just downright skeptical. And it's good to be downright skeptical. And I'm not quite sure how one would seek to draw boundaries between what are legitimate skeptical or critical challenges to consensus and what are illegitimate ones. So I would want to throw that back at you, Brian. And a final comment on the openness question. What is openness and what is transparency? Of course, it means everything and it means nothing, doesn't it now? I think from my context in climate change, I mean, there's a very particular thing about openness of data. And that, again, was a very, very, I mean, that was, for me, the key tragedy around Climategate. It revealed a very, very tight grip by a certain community on a certain type of data. And I think certainly in scientific practice, more generally, one has to find all ways possible of making data open and freely available. Yes, there are going to be always some constraints, but I don't think the constraints that applied in that case were credible constraints. How much deliberation should be open, of course, is a different matter altogether, and there needs to be some differentiation between spaces where argument and deliberation between scientific experts is private, and other spaces of deliberation which should be more open. And I'm not quite sure where you, again, find ways of identifying where those boundaries lie. But again, the cultural setting that we're now operating in as scientists is very, very different than it was 20 years ago. And science as a set of social institutions needs to, as science actually always does, I mean, science is always in the making. It's always changing its rules and procedures and norms, despite the popular notion that it isn't. And actually, can I just make one observation to pick up on a point that Mars made, which I fully endorse. I've made this point before, maybe in response to a comment you've made before, but I'll say it again, which is about the training of scientists in epistemology, in policy making. I lament the cohorts of environmental scientists who come out of my university who would be struggled to define what epistemology is, or wouldn't even know what the linear model of policy making is, let alone to be able to critique it. And yet these are people coming out of a leading environmental science school. And I think that is a tragedy.
Okay. Fantastic. Well, I think we've got time for another round before tea at 3:15, so let me just continue. Over here.
Thank you. I'm Stephen Hill from Research Councils UK. My question is really trying to link some of the things that the three speakers have said and add some of my own experience onto that. So we heard about the importance of institutions in expert advice from Roger, and we heard from Miles about the role of policymakers within government and scientific experts within government in supporting those institutions. And we heard from Mike about consensus and dissensus and keeping both of those things alive. My personal experience was from being responsible for running one of those institutions, which is a scientific advisory committee. And what is very striking in that context is how rapidly the social context of the advisory committee kills dissensus and very rapidly leads to consensus building. And it's not an explicit process by the individuals there. It's a social response to being in a group of people. The in-group forms very quickly. And even when, as a supporter of that and an advisor trying to set that up, you deliberately try and build diversity into a group like that, consensus seems to crystallize very rapidly. How do we respond to that challenge?
Great question. Jan Marco, just behind there.
Jan Marco Müller from the European Commission. I manage the office of Englave. I'm German, and in Germany we have a very nice annual competition selecting the worst word of the year. And 2 years ago the winner was alternativlos, without alternative, which is one of the favorite terms used by the Chancellor when beat the Euro crisis, beat climate change, whatever. Something is always without alternative. And it's something which I also hear frequently in science. Something is without alternative. You have to do this. And I think we should be much more proactive as scientists to offer policy options to policymakers. You can go this way, you can that way, go that way, and these are the likely results you're going to get according to our models. Now, I agree with Roger that, of course, there is implicit danger that you predistort these policy options and you just offer the nice ones, without offering also an option which might have results which you as a scientist don't like, but which might be much more politically feasible. But if we go this way, offering options, I think we can be much more transparent in societal debate.
Great, let's carry on along the row. Naomi, just here, same row. Sorry. Yeah.
My name is Willemijn Tuinstra from the Open University in the Netherlands, but I'm also working on at the Netherlands Environmental Assessment Agency. I would like to comment on, I think the gentleman here raised a question and Mike told something about the open spaces on internet where dialogue is going on about sensitive issues or, well, the sensitivity of climate change or others. A colleague of mine is involved in the Climate Dialogue website, Bart Strengers, and he told that, or well, colleagues around told that sometimes it's difficult to get this discussion going on this side because certain topics suddenly you don't find the people who want to defend the mainstream thought anymore. So there is somebody in our institute who is a statistics specialist who could show that there is no real evidence of sea level rise in the North Sea, but it is very difficult for Bart to find somebody who to defend the opposite, though the feeling is that the common sense is that there is this sea level rise. Maybe I got the details wrong, but somehow there is this feeling of power or social feeling, or that people don't want to be the one anymore to be the one to defend maybe the wrong thing. And then I noticed when I was thinking to make this comment, should I say this at all? So there is some power here working as well. And then I want to add that at the Open University we are having a course on this boundary of science and policy, and we want to learn in this course to teach the students of natural sciences and environmental sciences in the Netherlands to deal exactly with these questions and the choices you have to make and the roles you can play. And well, that's, I think, a step ahead that we're trying this.
Great. Moving now to the third row back here, but I think actually this theme of policy education for scientists is, I think, one that we might pick up on, and I'm very interested in where the boundary lies between pre-distortion as Roger put it, and being an astute scientist who knows how to pitch their message well, which is something we might applaud. So I'd quite like the panel to respond to that. I mean, when is this a good thing, and when is it actually distortion of good evidence? I think it's a bit of a fine one. Third, okay, so got a question here.
Yes, my name is Kate Bloor. I'm a self-employed researcher, and I think what people have been talking about is really, in general terms, the influence of science on policy making. But is there not a huge set of issues around the influence of policy making on science, as such that in some situations science is suppressed and stifled, and that science only follows policy questions that are very restricted, and that this, if you're talking about democracy and science, there are a whole set of issues there to be thought about.
Great. We've got lots, but I'm going to take a few more. You're going to have challenges coming back on these guys. And the lady in the orange sweater here.
Thank you very much. I'm Astrid Walker-Bourne from Practical Action, and I would like to kind of ground the debate back into the perspective of an ordinary citizen, maybe a poor farmer in a developing country whose government is being advised by all of us on the different technologies and signs in terms of what to do. And I'm really wondering what we need. So I really welcome the sort of the challenge of the linear model completely, the embracing of complexity and uncertainty in the the multitude of voices having a real impact on what works and what doesn't work for poor people. But how do we make that a reality? Because the kind of the power that lies in our hands as a scientist, social or otherwise, talking to governments, where do these voices, other than through social media, actually come in and are heard? And, you know, how much should we challenge the authority of scientists? Which in developing countries, quite frankly, the expert is still the person who holds power in NGOs as much as the governmental sector. So how do we make spaces and processes really work for those voices who do not understand and might not be able to articulate themselves as well as we can in terms of the questions we don't even know how to ask? So back to the user perspective and grounding it in realities of particularly poor people.
Excellent, thank you for that. Now down at the front here.
Hi, I'm Jill Rutter. I'm from the Institute for Government. We've been doing some work on evidence and evaluation in government and wrote something called Is the Problem of Supply or Demand? And I think we've been focusing quite a lot on the supply side. I think one of the questions is quite interesting. You bothered to ask for restaurant advice, whether it was from the concierge or getting your guidebook or whatever. What institutional changes do you think might be useful to promote the question more often rather than just proceeding to answer things?
I'm going to take one more, and I think it's on the right here. Tracy, yeah.
Hello, I'm Tracy Elliott from the Royal Society. I wondered if there's an issue around the way we frame evidence-based policy making. And we often think of science evidence being used to inform policy options for policies then to be made. Very often I think evidence is used to support policies that have already been formulated, and there's a sort of retrofit. So I wondered if there's a role for the science community to evidence test and think about things, framing evidence-based policy making in a sort of testing fashion. And secondly, on the openness of data, the Royal Society produced a report last year on science as an open enterprise, which raises some of these very important issues and tasks scientists with making their data and their metadata much more readily available and accessible for re-verifying and reusing. So I have a few copies of those if you're interested, and if you want to talk about that, then I'm very happy to do that. Thank you.
Great. Well, I think that's probably all we've got time for, because I want to give the panel a chance to respond to a large array of questions. And I'm very pleased that the reciprocal relationship, how policy influences science, has also come up, because this is clearly a two-way mutual field. So should we start with Mike this time?
Well, I think one observation that sort of again tries to tie some of these things together is the not so much back to the question about the education of scientists about the nature of their practice or the nature of policy, but actually this sort of widespread perception across society at large, certainly in the UK, and maybe internationally, the lady who commented from a developing country or poor people's perspective that the expert is the expert. The science is the science, and science is something that offers this view of the world which is unchallengeable, which is converging on a certain answer to a particular question. And this, of course, underlies a lot of the tactics that are used, and going back to Brian Wynn's question about the lobbyists who have a particular interest in undermining the authority of science, and they use the uncertainty card and say, well, we need to sow doubt. I mean, Oreskes' book is called Merchants of Doubt. But that only has traction in a culture or in a society that thinks that science is not about doubt or uncertainty, that science is about certainty. If that understanding of science as an open-ended process of inquiry that is always provisional, that is always ragged, that is always contingent, that is always contested, then actually that appeal by the ideological interests would have very much less traction than it had in the case of climate change. And of course it works in the opposite way around. How is it the NGOs in the 1990s who appropriated climate change as their campaigning issue were able to play on the consensus card and in order to advance their particular policy solutions? Because science is about getting it absolutely right. And if that is absolutely right, then of course policy follows from that. So it's a wider question about, I would suggest, representing science in a much more populist way that opens spaces for challenge and a dispute, and actually weakens the diversionary tactics that certain interests will use by trying to play the uncertainty card. One other question was about the thing about the role of the blogs, or the role of the blogs or these dialogue spaces using new social media, and the reluctance of certain experts to participate. That is a very interesting observation. So why is it that experts may be reluctant to participate? It's not true across the board. I mean, certainly in the last 2 or 3 years, quite a number of climate scientists have very actively entered into those sorts of debates and dialogues on the internet. But I would suggest that, in fact, it should be, if not mandatory, it should be something that certainly is much more highly encouraged. Most of the areas, I can't really think of many issues around climate science that are not live centres of active scientific argument within the professional scientific community. And if they're active sites of scientific disagreement within the professional community, why can't they be active sites of deliberation in more public spaces? The questions about the climate sensitivity, the questions about what is the relative contribution of blacks. So all of these things are going through radical changes in the way in which scientists think about them. So why aren't mainstream scientists actually showing a wider public audience science in the making, argument in the making? We are arguing about this professionally, and we want to show that argument and actually listen to what a wider set of views are about how these different lines of evidence are reconciled or are not reconciled. So I think it's part of this wider repositioning what science is as a form of inquiry or as a social institution, away from the textbook view that science produces definitive answers that are either right or wrong.
And following on from that, some of this presupposes that scientists are in some way uniquely honest, open, unbiased, subjective, and that, I must say, has never quite been my experience. I think this is something that Roger addresses. His honest broker title worried me when I read it, because I don't believe that honesty is quite the issue here. Objectivity, and he does address this in the book, comes from the interaction of scientists and open debate and open challenge, not from some innate virtue in the science community. And that leads into Melissa's question about predistortion, education, communication, and so forth. Perhaps not entirely flippantly, we should add rhetoric alongside epistemology to what we train scientists in, not so much to make them better rhetoricians as to make them understand how the careful choice of words changes or distorts the message. And a better understanding of how it is people are using and abusing language in order to sow doubt or whatever ought to be part of that training for young scientists. And that in turn leads into Kate's question about the influence of policy on science. I think I'd say, at least in our UK context, one of the virtues we have is diversity, and some of that goes right back to Haldane and the original enunciation of the Haldane principle, which left us with, on the one hand, the bit that everybody remembers, the idea that scientists ought to lead the development of science. And the bit that nobody remembers is that Haldane said that where politicians and others have a need for science, they should indeed invest in applied science and encourage the science community to focus on real problems. And I think this diversity of funding sources, diversity of ways in which science actually happens, is probably itself virtuous in this particular context. I think it helps us to keep the debate open. And picking up the point that was made about ordinary citizens and how they can engage with what is often very complex, very technical, really difficult debates about very subtle issues. I think it's worth thinking outside science and thinking about how we as a set of ordinary citizens relate, for example, to legal debate, or to economic debate, or to military thinking. The answer is we're all stupid on that sort of stuff, and what we rely on is mediation of some sort. We rely on good journalism, good books, other ways of getting our information. That's equally true of science. One of the things I think that's been really encouraging over the last few years has been the development of organizations like the Science Communication Centre, designed to actually help the wider public into this position. Now, I'm not simply reiterating a deficit model here, but I do think that mediation in complex debate is an absolutely essential part of policy making, and it should be supported rather than derided. And I think, but I'm not entirely sure, that touches on Jill's question about how to promote the question. And forgive me if I've got this wrong, Jill, but if what you're getting at is the issue of how things become political in the first place, how something gets off the bench and out of the journals and actually becomes a social issue, I think there are always going to be multiple routes, and they're certainly going to include charismatic scientists talking about science and science issues. They're going to include the Rachel Carsons of this world writing about science from a secondary perspective. They're going to include the likes of Bob Watson and others getting excited about the Arctic ozone hole and talking to people. So I think there are a myriad different ways in which things can become political, and promoting questions about those is a question of how really the political community reacts to the emergence of new problems, and that's perhaps a wider discussion. But forgive me, Jill, if I'm answering the wrong question.
All right, I'll make 3 quick points since I'm standing in between us and the coffee break. the importance of institutions is to create a safe space where options, diversity, uncertainty can be recognized. And sometimes that diversity has to be built in as part of the terms of reference, the mandate of the institution. Military organizations often mandate a red team and a blue team to come up with the best case for the opposing point of view. In my graduate courses where I do teach practicing scientists, lab scientists about policy and politics, we do an exercise, and I usually pick a controversial topic like climate change or endangered species, and I ask them to assemble a scientific advisory panel, usually to answer scientific questions. And they start out by saying, we're going to get the best scientists available. And to give you an example, at the end of this most recent exercise, one student said, I realized that I wasn't looking for the best scientists when I was Googling for young Hispanic female climate scientists to put on the panel. The extra scientific factors come in, and so that's why institutions matter, to make these it's safe in order to do this. Now, for science arbitration, we have very robust mechanisms for assembling diverse panels. Honest brokering, I think, is, with a few exceptions that you can point to around the world, kind of uncharted territory, and it's challenging. So let me give you an example. Honest brokering refers to policy options. And I recognize after I published the book that sometimes people see the word honest and then they stop reading right there and say, oh, I'm honest, no problem. The point there is that you're honest brokering, that you are coming up with a suite of options as a group that maybe you wouldn't advocate the large majority of, but they represent some sort of solution space. Now, in some of the writing that I've done, and Mike's participated, what if it's the case, just entertain this as a possibility, that the carbon problem, just the carbon problem of climate change, no longer needs climate science. This is what gets me in trouble with folks like Bob. What if it's an energy technology problem? What if we give the IPCC a Nobel Prize? Thank you very much. Now go on your way. The problem now is developing cheaper energy. And in fact, people who assert it's a atmospheric problem like the IPCC are only making things worse. Now, where do we have a place where we could have that debate of honest brokering, of problem framing? Because I can tell you there are 4,000 climate scientists who do not, for reasons of power, want the problem to be defined as something other than what they're focused on. Now, the second point, I think we have to be very clear about what sort of business we're up to. If we're in the business of trying to improve the practice of politics or to perfect society, that's great, that's noble, but that's a very different topic than improving the practice of providing scientific advice. And I think we sometimes get those conflated. And we subscribe to that heroic, rationalistic view that we can perfect society through expertise. The final point gets to the notion of supply and demand for science. Dan Sarowitz, who's a brilliant thinker many of you know of, he's at Arizona State University. He and I wrote a paper called Reconciling the Supply of and Demand for Science. And it was a very elaborate paper about doing science arbitration. The question we always get on that is, what if the policymakers are asking the wrong questions? Shouldn't we in the expert community tell them what the right questions are? And I guess my response is that we need an effective division of labor. I want there to be a concierge who stands there and tells me answers to questions I have. I don't want the concierge putting his thumb on the scale or sliding $10 or getting money from a restaurant for sending me there. I want fair answers to those questions. At the same time, there is room in society for someone to go to policymakers and say, you know, by the way, that whole thing about the hockey stick and paleoclimate, not so relevant to energy prices going forward. We in the expert community have enough diversity that we can do multiple things at once and have independence of those groups. Where we get into trouble is where we try to do multiple roles at the same time. Here's the questions you should be asking and let me answer them for you. That's what gets this mix-up between advocacy, honest brokering, and arbitration, which I think we need to keep clear, and institutions are the way to do that.
Well, thank you all so much. I think we've had an incredibly rich set of insights from our panel and also questions from the floor. It strikes me how very different the tone of this discussion has been from some of the recent discussions about science authority and policy making, which has made the argument that politicians should be scientists or should learn more science. Actually, a lot of what we've been talking about this afternoon is the way that scientists can be more open about their processes, their disagreements, and communicate those better and engage with politics and politicians better in ways that can take forward more pluralistic decisions. It's a very different set of arguments, and I think a challenging set that also really puts in place how one thinks about objectivity. Objectivity is really about being open about disagreements and about the positions that scientists are coming from. And I think, too, we've raised some really key questions about the roles of culture and of power. Don't think we've nailed them, because I think there are still many questions to be explored about why this model of more open, pluralistic science advice in policy isn't happening. But hopefully we will get to grips with those further as we go ahead. We've now got a tea break, and then afterwards we're going to be moving straight into a session which very much takes forward some of the questions people have raised about science beyond expert groups, science in the public sphere, and indeed who are the experts who should be pronouncing upon these questions in a context where the users are often very poor and marginalised, or at least they're now communicating through different kinds of media.